Good morning, everybody. My name is Derek Johnson. I am wrapping up a 3-year term as past president of the Council of Competitive Intelligence Fellows. If you were on the second day summit that we did, wrapped up about 30 days ago, you might have seen me do the day 2 wrap up. That's not what we're here to talk about today. What we're here to talk about today is more advanced than that, actually, looking at both in terms of the story arc between the 5 summits now that the fellows have run over the past 5 calendar years, as well as what's most actionable for you as intelligence practitioners, the people in the trenches doing the work, so to speak, having to have your insights, your analysis hold up to levels of scrutiny that can be very intense at times, right? Let's just be honest about that. Executives are demanding. I know August and Cynthia both have direct war stories to share when it comes to that type of thing. And that's really one aspect, story arc, summit to summit over the past 5 years. We're going to talk about what's most actionable from this year's summit, as well as kind of going next level on those various sessions that were held. And then we're going to talk about what's next, what's coming next, both for the fellows and its broader programming, as well as what comes next for you all. I did want to share something. We're all adults here, and just in the interest of setting the tone for today's webinar, I think that Dr. Ben Gilad, when he was on day 1, moderated by Cynthia, said it very well. And I'm gonna say this quote out loud, direct. And if you're disappointed with the quote, take it up with Ben. Practitioners need to ask the tough questions without, and this is the key word, without appearing to be an asshole. And so with that, August, Cynthia, it's a tremendous honor to be on the page here with you all. Those are some funky lights. Did you just do that, August? In
That was
response
his
to that quote?
aura.
Wow, that is amazing. August, you're muted, so
Yep,
there
I'm
we go.
muted. Sorry. Zoom just told me that. Yeah, the laser lights were the celebration of that quote because I think it is sort of a laser focused distillation of the challenge of being a competitive intelligence professional. Thanks so much for sharing that one, Derek.
You bet. Take it away. What do
And
you
in
have
all
for our audience
fairness,
today?
we actually made Derek say it. So,
You know,
yes.
true. But again, I'm making it Ben's problem if you really have a problem with it out there.
and
Everybody.
and I'll actually assume responsibility too because we did the pre-work on that and discussing what we wanted to discuss and I think that that's the importance of well, part of the importance of that is not just the content of what he's saying, but the fact that he's speaking hard truths. And
Mhm.
that's something that we all need to lean into as practitioners. And that's why I'm particularly gratified that we've had this wonderful arc. And those of you who've been with us in these summits over the 5 years, each summit has a theme. Within the theme, we have an arc, and then we arrive at summit conclusions. And but if you look at the various summits that we've had since 2020, it itself has an arc.
Mhm.
And so we have gone through the various types of topics, starting with the future of CI from 2020 to what's next. And that was in 2020. In technology we trust was the next one where we looked at technology and how that's bearing on CI. Then foresight now harnessed for the future, looking at the importance of foresight and how we practice. And then last year's competitive intelligence, transforming new realities. So that's starting to crystallize. And this year, leaning into the new intelligence in terms of our best practices, everything we've learned, everything we've been seeing, and collecting that along with our historical traditional practices, right? Anchoring in that. And that really was the premise, the impetus of this particular theme. And throughout, I think been pretty clear-eyed about a lot of things that were pretty uncomfortable for folks, right? Going back to some of these hard truths. And so with that, I just wanted to anchor that for us contextually, and then turn this over to August, because I know we've had wonderful discussions about this, and you, I, and many of our fellows have been a part of this long journey of the various summit arcs. And so this particular approach and topic has been near and dear to us.
Absolutely. I mean, very, very near and very dear. One of the reasons the session with Ben Gilad was really so valuable is because it encapsulated in a lot of ways the past and the present and a vision of the future for the profession. Of course, we all, many of us, I should say, know that Ben Gilad is sort of one of the founders of competitive intelligence as a professional functional practice. Certainly one of the most renowned individuals from within our profession, and to get that perspective of, where were we, how did we get here, and his perspective on where we're going. And I thought in a lot of ways very prescient, recognizing some of the significant challenges that artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies present for us. And then that being the starting point for a full 2 days of programming that in many ways were the most practical of any of the summits or the programming that the CI fellows have done, since, and, we're going on, 5-6 years now, that we've been doing this sort of programming for the broader community. But much more practical, than thinking about some of the sessions where we would get very specific about this kind of advice or this kind of tool that we were using, and I think we're still at a vanguard in a way, but recognizing the fact that some of the technologies we were talking about in a little bit more of maybe a theoretical sense are themselves practical tools today. So I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that probably all of us on this call and in the webinar have been using generative AI. Maybe it's not part of our daily practice, but it's not something that's completely foreign to us. I'm sure we've all gone to ChatGPT or one of the other commercially available LLMs and made use of that. And so the practical realities that came through and that were sort of the genesis or the premise of the arc of this year's summit, I think were really, really quite valuable. I certainly took away some action items from various sessions, like, I'm going to go take that. A couple of the tools in the OSINT session I went out and signed up for, and I imagine some other people did as well. So in that sense, just reflecting momentarily on this moment in the profession and some of the opportunities that we have available to us. Cynthia, bringing it back to you, what were some of the opportunities that you really saw, sort of hiding behind those maybe uncomfortable truths in a couple of instances?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think, and I hope that the audience too, especially those of you who have attended this, think about these questions as well, right? Because certainly, like, we'd love to hear from you sharing this in the Q&A. But yeah, I think for me, there are, for me, these sessions, well, this particular summit, I have specific takeaways, right, from individual sessions. And I also have the broader takeaway, right, that you get by looking at the sessions in its entirety, these sessions in its entirety, the summit in its entirety, and how the various components mesh together. What are the messages that we're hearing? And so for me, we started with Ben at the fireside chat, and there were so many wonderful insights to what makes Ben tick and what makes a great analyst tick, that he shared. Some of them I think are innate and personal, but I think others are various types of characteristics that we can try to cultivate in us, right? Or certainly aspire to. And so, some things that, for example, like always questioning or being skeptical, right, about what you're hearing, taking the outsider's perspectives and knowing your strengths and leaning into that. And then conversely, knowing what you're not particularly good at, right? And so I think that allows us to be clear-eyed. And I think that set a wonderful tone for the rest of the summit as well, because I think taking these principles through the various sessions, listening from the Great CI Divide, which was technically the first session, to your session, where we really talked about more about the psychological and organizational behavioral aspects and so forth. So much of that, what Ben had shared with us, could be woven through. So I feel like that's particularly important for us to anchor on as we continue. And one other thing too is that he mentioned not being too trusting, right, of leaders and ourselves. So it's these aspects that I think are perennial, right? And that maybe helps us segue into the Great CI Divide, which was the first session in which Richard Caldwell moderated a panel, and they really talked. They talked about what they've learned over the past 3 decades or so in terms of CI practices, and then I won't go into each of the sessions too much, because I think maybe you and I can kind of take this step by step and work through some of the session highlights and what our takeaways are. But I think that that these afford us the foundations on which to build, especially in a time of so many new practices, novel tools that and transformations that come from that, right? Disruptions that come from that. It's very easy to become unmoored. And we have seen that, I think, in slower motion with the advent of technological tools, in which some practitioners might not have even picked up some foundational tools along the way, especially I think newer, younger ones. And I think that was a premise of the discussion, was part of the discussions of the second session. When they talked about education, and they also leaned into, again, foundational principles. But I think as we're entering into this transformation and these transitions, it's just very easy, I think, for us to maybe chase the next shiny thing, or perhaps even buy into sales pitches, right? And AI is going to take care of XYZ for you, and so on. And I think that starting this summit out with some of these foundational aspects are, in fact, best practices. So anyways, my long-winded way of kind of saying that, it's really important for us not to forget where we came from.
Yeah, and I see Derek's comment in there. So, connecting the dots between the two. I really appreciated the fact that we bookended the summit with your conversation with Ben, and then the session that I was so proud to moderate about the intersection of human intelligence and competitive intelligence and the stakeholder mindset, and having just this really amazing panelists that. The connecting point between those two bookends for me was, in light of technological innovation that has the potential to displace so much of what CI professionals do, that the human element, and this gets to the comment that Derek, you just dropped in the chat, the human element becomes ever more important to differentiate us. This is the second significant paradigm shift I've had the privilege to live through or work through in my competitive intelligence profession. The first being the first truly effective search engines. Very early in the 2000s, Google enters the mainstream, and all of a sudden some CI stakeholders are looking at what CI professionals are doing and saying, well, I think I can do a lot of that on my own. And they weren't 100% right, but they weren't entirely wrong either. And now we're in this this like I said, second paradigm shift where I'm having conversations with stakeholders, and they're like, well, I went to Copilot, or I went to Claude, and it gave me an answer, so boom, problem solved. And it's like, well, really? Because what I experienced in that first paradigm shift is, it's like humans never run out of needs, and humans also kind of never run out of problems either. So all of a sudden, going back to the last paradigm shift with search engines, all of a sudden information is so much easier to find. And previously, one of the values of competitive intelligence was I can find the information that's difficult to find. So information becomes easier to find. That specific capability becomes commoditized a little bit. But then you've got a whole new problem because now there's too much information. And oh my gosh, how do I separate what's true from what's false and make sense of it all and all those sorts of things? And then, so the horizon of competitive intelligence value add moved to something new. And we're still very early days in that second paradigm shift, but I really think the human element, the human dimension that Ben spoke to, that Derek, that you're talking about, that the panelists that I had the privilege of moderating were speaking to, that's the new horizon for CI professionals to add value. And then Cynthia, taking it back to your point about the fundamentals, we still have some amazing fundamentals within our profession to build on. And the first one that always sticks out for me is the intelligence cycle itself. And yeah, it's not really a cycle. Chris Wheaton and his students at Mercyhurst back in the day,
yeah,
really illustrated and validated that. But it is a fantastic foundation on which we have to build. So I'm very excited about the opportunities we have as that horizon begins to shift.
And in this summit, the summit agenda actually roughly follows that cycle too, and that was no accident, right?
Correct.
So that's also something that we need to point to. But I want to touch on, this was not highlighted at the session, but I think this is one of the takeaways that we've, I think, all had, even pre-summit, along this transformational journey. The fact that we are the first generation to live through two major innovation points, right? Innovation cycles. So now we're on the cusp of another one. And so no other generation has had the benefit of living through a prior one to be able to learn through those lessons, learn from those lessons. And so that's one of the things that I do hope that we'll lean into. And I think that in our programs we've tried to do that as well, because you and I and Craig McHenry and others have been a part of discussions about AI, for example, in webinars and so forth. And I think in terms of ongoing, to really think about these lessons learned. And I think we see some of that also in this particular summit programming as well. We saw some skepticism about AI, right? Healthy. But I think we've also seen too that in some cases people were very dismissive to the point where they just didn't care to use it at all, right? And so I think that was another thing that I picked up on, a perspective that I picked up on, that I think we need to incorporate. Right or wrong, it exists. And so as we move into new intelligence practices, new best practices, we need to be mindful of that. One thing is, I do know that we've had some wonderful chats here. And I don't know, Derek, did you want us to key in on any of these? Because I know Andrew has had some great ideas.
I think Andrews is one that ought to be addressed right away. I'm seeing it a couple different times. It might just be being reposted, but especially that one about is it not the same perspective as misinformation on the internet back in the day, and maybe the reason why Dow Jones, Factiva, and AlphaSense are still in business.
Yeah, but I do think, though, to that point, Gen AI, and then of course once Gen AI becomes more hybridized with other forms of AI, I think it is really going to take us beyond what Dow Jones, Factiva, AlphaSense, have been able to do, right? It's not simply informational anymore. There will be insights. There already have been early insights that some of these more sort of edge innovative tools are affording us. And I won't get into it because this is not this session. This is not what the topic is, but this is part of the principles that Ben was talking about. We're always having to ask questions, and we're always having to penetrate what is beneath the surface. Is that so much of these developments are actually happening under the radar. These things are happening where you have billion-dollar investments in AI R&D in some large corporations, and do you think they're going to publish their findings? No, they're just going to apply it. So, and they're after insights. So I think it's important for us not to anchor ourselves into the way that we have come up in practicing Intel, the way we've anchored ourselves into information-based products and what those products look like, the new products will look very different. And some of them won't even have a look. It's going to be right underneath us, right? It's going to be, sort of below the radar. And so I think it's really important for us to take those principles that Ben highlighted and in some cases reminded us to penetrate that. And I think that brings us to, I'm going to skip ahead actually, that brings us to August session, right, where really looking at how we frame things in the way that we approach problems. And certainly you and your panelists focused on stakeholders, but we can apply this, so much of what was discussed, Andy, Laura, and I'm forgetting
And
yeah, that each of them brought their various facets in which their superpower was seeing what others couldn't see and then help guide them through it. And I think that that's one of the biggest takeaways, is that we need to go beyond the explicit. We need to go beyond what, people, the habits, the habitual thinking, the biases and the assumptions. And I think that was a very, very important to me, a very important session, to be able to sort of reframe, have us question, going back to Ben, some of our approaches that maybe need a refresh. Maybe it was also never a best practice in the first place, that we were just leaning into the way our brains want to function. So one thing was that Laura said, she highlighted the fact that the language that we use in our practices tend to be the language of war and they're very adversarial language, and that anchors our thinking in a certain direction, to the point where maybe it's not allowing us to see other options. And so it's these types of things that I think the alpha, which was the Ben session, and then the omega, which was your session, allows us to penetrate that. And I think that's one of the broader takeaways of the summit, beyond all the various kind of best practices within each of the session. One note, I think we forgot to mention this at the beginning, the recordings will go out to the attendees. So in about 30 days, at the end of the month, look out for the recording link in your mailboxes, check your spam folders. And then for those of you who missed the summit, you can listen to the recording as well, and that will be posted where you can you purchase the recordings, and that will also be around the same time. Did I get that right, Derek?
You did. Yes, you did. So I think within the next few weeks, all that'll be posted. You'll have an opportunity. If you couldn't make it, I know I had a number of people reach out to me saying, hey, I had another conference I had to attend and so on, which is obviously understandable. We didn't want that FOMO to last forever. So you're going to have a chance, absent the chat, which I think this year's summit, the chat was absolutely on fire, especially for both of your sessions that you did. I see Ellen's note. I think we have not made that decision as an XCOM just yet, but I believe it's going to be the whole package. There's going to be enough of these things that you're going to want. You're not going to want to have to pick and choose.
And might I add,
I agree.
Our conversation here, I think that there's value in seeing the entire summit, because there is that summit arc, and there are threads that run through this. And so to be able to, I think, really appreciate, say, August session, or even, Ben's session at the beginning, to have kind of these, just to be able to hear the conversations in between. So, for example, the discussion about strategy and war games, that we heard, that I think provided some also very interesting insights, about, the various sort of novel best practices. Because, for example, one thing that Arjun Singh had highlighted for that session was that pre-COVID, war games were really exclusively run live in person. And post-COVID, I think he said it was about 100% now virtual, and
Mm-hmm.
it's actually just as successful, just as useful and powerful. And so that is a new best practice. That is part of the new intelligence that we've come out with. And so it's really important to hear, I think, those types of practices too, in addition to maybe some of your favorites. So I do want to just highlight that as well.
Yeah, and if I can double click on that for a moment, because there were really great linkages. That session in particular had some fantastic practical advice on handling objections from stakeholders when they presented information to you, or when you presented information to you that sorry, you presented information to them that they were skeptical about, and they expressed that skepticism back to you, and sort of how do you navigate that, and what are some of the collaborative mechanisms that you undertake in order to sort of bring them around to your point of view, or to the very least, seeing the validity of your point of view and your approach to developing that point of view. That I think resonated for me. Certainly I saw the connection between many of those points and some of the points that Laura, Andy, and Anne were trying to make in the session about stakeholder mindset, and the recognition and understanding of the vulnerability that CI practitioners engender in our stakeholders. And Cynthia, taking it back around to your point about seeing what others don't see, I think very often in the profession we have not seen that. We have not understood or really leaned into the premise of, hey, we're inside of the corporation, we're actually kind of the boogeyman for some people in various ways, whether we're threatening their ego, or they feel judged in various ways. And those are obstacles. Those are also opportunities. And thinking about some of the very practical applications that Arjun was speaking to, and as I'm sitting there in his session, thinking like, oh my gosh, you're kind of stealing my thunder a little bit here, but in a good way, for some of the things that we wanted to get to in the final panel, talking about, well, what are some of the practical applications of that knowledge that you do engender that vulnerability. So what do you do about that? I love the fact the phrase, it's an ugly baby, came up in so many different sessions. I think Rich was the first one who brought it up. Arjun probably said it. I think in the ROI session, we talked about ugly babies as well. And to link this to the intelligence cycle too, if you're bringing the stakeholder along at the various and appropriate points within the intelligence cycle, you can get them to understand it's an ugly baby. Yeah, Andrew, I agree. Poor baby. That baby gets picked on a lot. They can come to understand and come on that journey with you and sort of overcome their vulnerability. If you have the practical steps to bring them along and do that. And I think Arjun's session in particular, the scenario analysis session, did a really great job of laying that out.
And I feel,
Yeah,
oh,
yeah.
And,
Yeah,
and
please,
like
yeah.
that was a great midpoint in the summer,
Yes.
so to speak, because it was that session bridged very nicely some of Ben's messages and then some of the messages in your panel. So one of the things, sorry, excuse me, that was highlighted was also the inside out versus sorry, the inside out versus the outside in perspective. And Ben talked about having that outsider's perspective, and then your stakeholder mindset also helped to flesh out some of the principles and some concepts here. And in fact, I want to highlight one that I think I don't want to go sort of too much into the weeds of all the takeaways, but Andy himself had highlighted quite a few things, and one thing that he talked about was certainly avoiding taking things personally, right, and recognizing that these different kinds of changes are bringing new paradigms, right, into the stakeholder or the organization. And so I think that was also coupled with the idea that when people are not optimistic, for example, it's signs that maybe they're lacking in skills, rather than just chalking it up as, well, they just hold this view and you're closing yourself off. So Andy, I think, helped us sort of uncover what's behind what what people might be thinking and feeling and seeing, and then helping us, I think, calibrate our own reactions to that, right? Being able to own that. And I really feel like that's, that's very particular, that's particularly important, so that we, this is kind of, used very often, but we're empowered, right? To be, I think, take more positive actions. And then even to be open to those messages, because sometimes we kind of shut ourselves off to those kinds of messages. Like one thing he said that really resonated with me was resistance to change and other challenges are good data, right? When you see that, that's good data. And that helps you depersonalize, that helps you, help to compartmentalize, it helps you, I think, put it in its place so that we can manage that. We have some agency, I think, in those situations. So I think that these discussions about the different perspectives, from Ben to Arjan's session, to yours, I think are very, very important. Another really important takeaway, these threads throughout these summit sessions.
Yeah, and maybe a little bit of a ham-handed shout out to another session that I found really valuable, was the conversation on the return on competitive intelligence. Because of course, one of the things that we have to recognize with our stakeholders is many of them have a very quantitative mindset, and they want to see numbers, and they want to know, for example, like how are you doing? How are you adding value to the business? And I think that's a very existential question for the CI professional, particularly the corporate practitioner these days. Again, in light of the technological shift that we're undertaking here, where some stakeholders might start to feel like, well, there are many pieces of this that I can kind of do myself. So, what's your return versus just throwing the question over to ChatGPT. And I think that session, which I do recommend watching it a couple of times, because I thought a lot of great information went really fast in that session. It helps you build a framework for demonstrating the value in the business, and one of the ways to do that is to get comfortable with qualitative ROI. And that session spent a lot of time talking about qualitative ROI. And I was so glad that they did, because, to the point that Andrew just made a moment ago in the chat, relationships really are critical. And if you think about some of different qualitative methods to sort of capture and demonstrate value on relationship, and that's something that a large language model really can't demonstrate or build. I don't know, maybe some of the fake, boyfriend girlfriend models can fake it. I don't know, but we're not Joaquin Phoenix, talking to Scarlett Johansson's disembodied voice quite yet, in the corporate setting. So I thought that session was really quite good as well.
Yeah, and I think that also brought us back to get the foundational questions, but there are also layers of new practices. So I felt like, while people were still exploring the perennial question of ROIs, like you said, leaning more into qualitative aspects, and then finding ways to make the qualitative more meaningful to people who are even quants, right? So I remember one of the sort of discussion threads was about aligning with the CFO and how the CFO approaches the different problems and frames and so forth, and the tools that they use. And then I particularly enjoyed when one of the panelists mentioned, well, you've got data scientists who are already working on all these various types of models, and they're already they're already working on ROI for other units. Then why not having the CI unit tap into their talents, their methods, and so forth, expand that out so that it's contextually more meaningful. That is a novel practice. That's a part of new intelligence that we really haven't been practicing systematically. Right. So it's these new intelligence takeaways that also have these foundational underpinnings that I find very, very meaningful in this particular summit.
I really like that linkage of, hey, looking at what is innovative in other functional roles and seeing how can we use that to um, innovate within competitive intelligence to demonstrate the value that competitive intelligence delivers to the business. That's really fantastic. One of the things that I'm thinking about in terms of that innovation too is, what are some of the ways we apply some of those foundational skills to help us adapt to the changes that competitive intelligence is sort of experiencing right now. So sort of doing CI on CI and looking at, okay, how effective am I, maybe benchmarking myself against to the best of my ability, other competitive intelligence functions within my industry or within the profession, and what am I seeing in terms of the application of new technologies and skills that they're that my CI peers are undertaking, and how can I learn from some of them as well.
And I'd like to extend that thought, because this is one that's near and dear, especially as we're entering this transformational phase, is while we're conducting CI on CI, let's look at our even informal internal competition. And I don't mean head-to-head competition, right? CI and KM back in the day, they kind of had this, informal competition for hearts and mind and budget, but budget being finite, right? There's only so much that could be allocated. So as we're thinking about ROI, as we're thinking about values, we're thinking about these other questions, where does CI fit in the mix, and how are we positioned, right? What is the sentiment? How are we valued? And I think that's something that, again, looking holistically at the summit sessions, that's one of the things that we can take away. And I also feel that, and this wasn't said explicitly, this is one of those that, you kind of have to look at the summit, parts to whole.
Oh yeah.
First session, once again, I think helps to refine some of that discussion from the ROI session, where we're talking about the stakeholder mindset, and then what your panelists had delved into in terms of their concerns and the challenges that they've encountered, tackling biases and perspectives and so forth, and just even how to manage sort of negative or uncomfortable inputs or feedback. Those things help us, I think, fine tune our approach to ROI also, especially when we're talking about qualitative aspects. So I want to highlight that, because I don't know that it was necessarily explicit, because they're two separate sessions. But again, the parts to the whole, when we look at them, together, applying your panel, to say, so looking backwards, to the various other sessions, I think people can get even more insights than just the parts, right? Of this.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And that, that session in particular was, I think, a really great connection back actually to last year's summit on competitive intelligence. And that was this sort of rethinking of some of those fundamentals and some of those foundational issues, and really looking at, and I think grappling with what you would call some of the, the uncomfortable truths. Because at that stage, we knew enough about generative AI to think maybe, is this the meteor sort of like, coming for the profession, and we're all the dinosaurs, that sort of thing. And I think this year where, the material reflected some of that adaptation that that we have been able to make, and I think got very practical in some wonderful ways. And various sessions, and I'm thinking here particularly about ROI, the OSINT session, and also the session on scenario analysis. I thought, for me, were the three where I thought, what I just thought, wow, we've got some really great practical insight coming out of these. Anyway,
you mentioned OSINT twice now, so I would love for you to dive into that a little bit more, and you got to share your biggest takeaways, because I can hear the excitement in your voice both times.
Well, it's interesting, because the biggest thing that I got, and I'm scrolling through to try to find my notes on the OSINT session, because I took copious notes the entire time. No, it's okay. But the biggest surprise that stuck with me is one of the panelists, Ari, and I'm sorry I can't remember his last name off the top of my head. somebody mentioned generative AI, and he kind of had that, I don't like that term. And I'm like, what is going on? I am so interested. I was looking at his LinkedIn profile as the session was beginning and everything, and realized just how lucky we were to have such a such a seasoned OSINT expert, renowned within the field, on this panel, and to have him have that sort of like, hey, hold on a minute. I kind of don't like that term. And we never did get a chance to dig into it, but I was really intrigued by that.
Yeah,
Um,
they
yeah,
really just, they just kind of like out of the gate went right into all the different kinds of
yes,
their favorite tools, which I thought was a great takeaway too from a practical perspective. But yeah,
yeah,
I think that definitely warrants a deeper dive, like maybe having him back on a webinar and just kind of
yeah.
into that, right? Or there's some other format. But I think that you're absolutely right. I think that keying into that, and then for me, I thought it was interesting. I think that it followed this particular session followed the the format of these types of the OSINT sessions. You said pretty frequently that they just kind of go into lean into what they do, which is like, these are my
Mhm.
favorites, and here, and check this out.
Yes.
But I think that, again, taking a step back and looking at it more broadly, I think that there are broader takeaways from that one as well. And for me, I felt like that one, you know, we got to see more clearly that the landscape is still very disaggregated, and it's
Mhm.
getting more so with the advent of AI tools. Now, so I think that the best practice that they shared, which is like, hey, OSINT sources are still largely reliant on a blend of generalized and specialized tools, and they went into all of that.
Mhm.
And then they also, I think, really importantly, because this isn't spoken enough, I actually have modules of this in my training, but I think generally speaking, people don't talk about this, but they said they go to local content very often, and there's special
Mhm.
tech searching local content. And and this is where I think it's sort of like OSINT sometimes doesn't get the respect that it should, because we
I
tend to
agree.
focus on primary. But garbage in, garbage out, it's an input. And if we have cognitive gaps, and if we have research gaps as a result of that, we're going to have gaps in our analysis. And I feel that uh, the lack of local content, it tends to be one of the perennial sins that we tend to commit as practitioners. So I'm so glad that
Mhm.
they highlighted that. But having said all this, those are the sort of the best practices that I think that in the aggregate we could get. But that landscape itself is already disaggregated because of where we've been since the dot-com boom, but it's
Mhm.
even more so now with generative AI. and
Mhm.
and the thing is, as the AI tools are starting to emerge, they're not emerging at a rate that's going to bring in more efficiencies or afford us better scope of coverage, right? It's just more on more, as opposed to these tools helping to solve these very sticky problems of, how do I grapple with the volume? How do I grapple with information overload and source overload? And then the multiplicity of source formats to be able to penetrate that, gather what we need, and collect and synthesize that,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
So that remains a very sticky problem. And so that particular session highlighted for me that, okay, we're just in for more of this stuff, right? For the time
Yeah.
being, until some genius figures out how, and this is where Gen AI is supposed to give us those solutions. But yeah, this is early days. So I think part of the new intelligence practice is to help solve those sticky problems.
Mhm. There's a few dots that I want to connect, because I think Ellen made a really interesting speculation in the chat that maybe OSINT experts feel threatened by Gen AI. And then, Cynthia, you just made a great point about, one of the strengths of really great OSINT people is they go to the local sources, or they go to the specialized sources, and the general, the person with general knowledge, or the general knowledge tool very often misses a lot of great information that's available there. And so, thinking about the lessons that we can extrapolate for for CI, and this is a thought I had earlier in our conversation and almost lost it. So I'm so glad Ellen brought it back for me. Is one of the things we need to be aware of as practitioners is that our stakeholders now are once again sort of feeling empowered to think like, hey, I can do this on my own. I'll just go to ChatGPT and do it and everything like that. And I, and we can definitely, throw up our red flags within the professional community to say, well, that's why you can't do that. That's wrong. Reason. I think one of the things we need to recognize too, and the more successful CI practitioners recognize this with search engines, is our stakeholders are still going to do that, and that we want our stakeholders inside of the business to be the best, to apply that information or apply those resources or those tools as best they can. So in a sense, part of our charge is to enable them to be good CI practitioners as well, or good CI generalists as best we can, so that we're empowering them with the appropriate skills. And I think the most important skill is the discernment for what's real versus what's misinformation, the benefits of triangulation, the benefits of validation, for example, of something that comes back from ChatGPT or some other large language model that's wrong. That some basic OSINT skills would help you validate or correct that information relatively quickly, as opposed to trusting it outright. Because I will say, in my own corporate practice, I have to recognize that in every conversation I go into with a stakeholder, they've either gone and done a general Google search for whatever I'm looking for, whatever question they're trying to solve for themselves, or they're looking for my help to solve, or they've gone to a large language model and asked the same question. So I go into every one of those conversations knowing that I have to do that as well, as sort of a baseline for, okay, what do they think they know? And how can I help them discern what's really valuable in that? So, I think OSINT professionals, to Ellen's point in the chat, are probably feeling a little bit about like you went to this, this general tool that sort of can guess at an answer, but where the real value is going local. And I think CI professionals are kind of in that same boat.
Yeah. So this is where I think my synapses are firing. Just they're just
That's what they do. Yeah.
yeah, but they're just on fire right now, and because there's so many different threads through this. But one thing I want to mention is that with OSINT, this has been a perennial problem, and we've been facing automation, right, as a perennial problem. We saw that first wave during the dot-com boom, where there were wholesale layoffs of information centers and research centers and so forth. Some of it also, was simply because of where the economy was, right, the economic cycle, but it didn't help. And so we're faced with the same thing as well. I know of information centers and research centers in large corporations that have been cut over the past year and a half. So 6 months in, after the explosion of generative AI, that's when I started to see my first, the first cuts, and they're not recovering. So they're just, they're gone. And we're seeing budget shrink and so on and so forth. And I think that part of this is these are part of larger conversations we can certainly have. But I think we do need to recognize these new realities as a part of the new intelligence. And I feel that it's really important for us to, and this is going back to your session again, right? In Ben's, seeing things with clarity. Yeah, sure. We can adopt the same approaches we've had to try to demonstrate value, have conversations and so forth, but that's only had limited success. And we need to understand why that's only had limited success. Why haven't we been able to, in these decades, make deeper, greater inroads into convincing executives of the value of this? I mean, we get it, right? It seems so obvious. So I think that that's a conversation we really need to dive into. And then I think that satisficing will always be our enemy.
Mhm.
The concept of good enough. People are not going to be for perfection. Executives don't care for that. They care about that necessarily either. They have their goals, and I think some of us want to maybe take a more elegant and complete approach to Intel, but the reality is that's not how most people are going to approach it. It's going to be pretty sloppy, and AI will make it sloppier in many ways. So
Sloppier, yeah.
how do we address that? And I think that some of these sessions, RI, the strategy session, certainly Ben's, your session, give us, I think, some pieces that we can start to work with. And I think that's an important outcome of this summit, right? Is that we are being shown some things that have been underutilized, under-recognized, and some things that are just brand new, right? Some things that Andy talked about, Laura, Anne. Well, I remember in one piece, I was like, at one point, Anne had mentioned how legal approaches a certain issue regarding clients. And I said, well, why don't we start doing that for CI, right? So I think that we can get a lot of some novel practices that can enhance our practice and become new best practices. So I think that that's something really important. But there's also one other point I want to quickly make too, is that when we're approaching OSINT, which is where we started here, most Intel practitioners, I would say, are not particularly good at it. We think we are, because we still buy into that whole, I can search on this and I can find some things online, therefore we're good. But we don't know what we don't know. And so it was when I was teaching this, we actually used and taught a lot of tools that are not being widely used. And that is a huge gap. And that gap is only going to widen with AI, because most folks don't have the understanding of how these tools are constructed and how these tools align with each other. And so even when putting together a search strategy, there were hints of this for those people who are trained in search strategy. So when you listen to Tracy Malief talk about how she approached certain problems, I think a trained info pro will go, oh yeah, we already know this stuff. But for folks who are not trained, they may have missed it altogether, that it was part of an overall set of approaches that when you are confronted with a key intelligence topic, or just, just a research concept, the way that you balance the general to the narrow, there are formulas, so to speak, right? And you might approach that. And we haven't properly internalized that into the Intel profession, practice. Librarians are here, or professional search, OSINT searchers tend to be over here, and then there's the rest of us. And then, sometimes so that's one thing that I want to highlight too, that I saw in that conversation, even if it wasn't explicitly stated, because I feel like that was important context that I hope people who go back to the recording should listen for. There's a reason why they weren't just throwing around, and this is cool. There was a little bit of that. But part of it too was there were frames that they were using that are underutilized generally among other Intel practitioners. So I just want to throw that out there.
Yeah, I think that's a really fantastic point. And I can see Derek.
We have 7 minutes.
Yeah, I figured that might be why you're rubbing those hands together.
Well, I was thinking now might be a good time to give the audience and others that might listen to this recording just a little bit of insight into the responsibility, as the CI Fellow sees it, for developing and continuing to deliver programming that is sort of next level. We're going to help people level up on a regular basis with a broader set of programming. I think in the chat today, August and Cynthia, we've seen some really great suggestions for future topics that could be dive deeper. Again, going back to the way I opened this webinar, the word appearing, or the appearance of, I think that's important. The old saying, dance like nobody's watching. Some people have an easier go of that later in their career. Or Ben's case, he does it irregardless. How can we help the next generations of intelligence and insights professionals develop this sort of aura about themselves, the lights that you introduced earlier in the webinar that allow them to do the same type of thing, go out there and create the right amount of, sort of friction or tension with the right stakeholders to be able to continue to make this practice about the creation of a human-centric, human-driven, with the right tools to allow for the efficiencies required to scale programs of this nature. How do we keep doing that? Especially as the fellows front, what would you both say, is both the opportunity and the responsibility of the council in terms of delivering on that brand promise?
Yeah.
Cynthia, would you like to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to. If although I just spoke last, I just feel badly that.
Please go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that what we've highlighted here is a good start, but I think more importantly, the summit itself is a great start. I think that start by listening to what people are talking about, because the way that this summit was constructed was looking back on what we had covered in the past and assessing where we are today. And so I think that taking some of these, the foundational tools, some of the timeless, practices and approaches, adding the new ideas and then continuing to innovate. And then that continual innovation part is the conversations that we'll continue to have. So, so I think that the summit itself, like past summits, established, kind of crystallized an idea. And now for the rest of the year, exploring that, diving into that. And I think commit ourselves to exploring how we might be able to incorporate novel approaches without abandoning very critical practices that will anchor us into the sound intelligence. So Ellen had just posted here too. So most of us don't know how to converse with execs. That needs to change. This isn't something new. Talk to Cliff Cow. Let's not forget people who are deep experts in some of these very human elements. And then the rest of us, August, you and I are, always like at the edge of the technology stuff. We can also add additional insights. And I know that Christoph had highlighted in his session, a novel tool that he's developing, using AI, for strategic decision making, right? So it's these layers that we continue to build on, but throughout we have to keep questioning ourselves in the way that Ben reminded us, and the way that your panel also has reminded us, August, and looking at things freshly, questioning, and then whatever comes along, we'll be open to it. Excuse me, and we adapt with it.
Yeah, from my perspective, I feel very privileged to be at this stage of my career, and where I'm in this situation with my CI fellows and with our professional peers beyond the CI fellows community, where we've had the experience and the challenges, the hard knocks, the scars of everything that that came earlier in our careers. And Derek, you used the word friction, and I thought that was a really great point, because the friction is actually in a lot of ways necessary for many of the changes that we're trying to drive in our organizations, and the information that we're bringing in, necessarily challenges the ego, the established points of view of very senior stakeholders. So to recognize that many of us have succeeded in a profession that is very much a mystery in most corporate settings. CI, I don't know what that is. I know what legal is. I know what finance is. I know what marketing is. CI, I really don't know what that is. We've got a CI team, but did they pick up my dry cleaning? Did they go out and assassinate executives from a competition? I don't know what that is. That we have this opportunity to continue to define what CI is and the value that we can deliver, but also that our primary function is as that sort of voice of challenge inside of the organization. So our commitment, my commitment as somebody at this stage in my career, and our commitment as CI fellows and CI fellows adjacent professionals, is to, I would say, educate and prepare the next generation foundationally for, hey, this is part of your challenge, and this is part of the opportunity, and it's one of the things you can be here for, and build a great professional career around it.
And I hope that we derive lessons, right, from our experience. Like you said, it's a privilege to
Yes.
be here. And then, you and I are the generation where we're living through two significant changes and disruptions. But we can draw from the lessons of the first. And so one of the things I want to highlight too, from all this is that while we're talking about all of these different tools, techniques, and so forth, that the underpinning of this is people, right? Any kind of any opportunities, any sort of lubrication or resistance will be all about the people. And Andrew mentioned culture in the chat, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's one facet of it. But there are also our biases and so on that we need to. So the idea here is that I hope that people get out of the summit that we're committed to the best practices, and then and to refining our best practices towards novel best practices, that will integrate these different elements, and to propose a more intentional integration of these things as a part of, and I'll go back to the title, the new intelligence best practices, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
is where we started. So from what Ben said, what your panel said, there's so much there, and then all points in between, the parts to the whole is something that I hope will be people's homework. Study that. You and I, August, are only scratching the surface, right?
Correct.
And other people will see so much more in these things to be able to create their own actionable items and then
Mm-hmm.
share it. And I think that that's really key, is that we learn from each other in that fashion.
Absolutely agree.
As we wrap up, the excellent answers. There's no wrong answer, but you both provide excellent answers wherever you go. And that's what I appreciate most about knowing you both. Betsy, I think, said it really well here. It can be a tough time to find our place in this field, right? I still feel that, and I've been doing this a while, like both of you. But it doesn't have to be a situation where you feel like you're isolated and alone. And I think that for me is what the fellows provides me in its greatest value, is this ability to say, I don't have to go it alone. I've got the fellows, there's plenty of people, we're plenty accessible, everybody out there. And I do hope that everybody leaves today's session saying, hey, August and Cynthia are approachable. The other fellows are approachable. Come and approach us, because while it can be tough to find our way in this field, and especially with what's happening in certain parts of corporate America these days, don't go it alone, everybody. There's an opportunity to have it be a lot more fun than that. So I want to thank you both, Cynthia, August, for coming on here, talking through the arc, talking about what's actionable, what's next. For the record, you've never appeared, either of you, to be what Ben suggested, at least to me. So I appreciate our friendship in that regard, and looking forward to the next opportunities to connect with you both. Thanks to everybody that's participated in today's session, especially if you got involved in the chat. We appreciate you, and be on the lookout for new programming, including how to access those recordings from the summit that happened about 30 days ago if you registered, or how you might buy the package if you didn't have the opportunity to attend. So with that, I'll be signing off. Cynthia, August, thank you very much. You have a good rest of your week.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you both, and thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everybody.